Hello, viewers. Thank you for joining us for this special online discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine. And I think my guests will probably agree with me that it is a war and not merely a special military operation. My name is Vince Brown. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics and Public Affairs at Dixie State University, soon to be Utah Tech University. And today I am joined by two very special guests, Dr. Don Jarvis, who is a retired professor emeritus of Russian who taught at BYU for 34 years. And Dr. Jarvis and I go a long way back. And so it's really great to see you again, Dr. Jarvis. We've spoken on the phone, of course, but it's been a while since we've seen each other in person. Thank you so much for being here. It's truly an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Happy to have you. And Nicole Brown, who lived in Ukraine for a period of time, has been involved in some of the protests recently since the war started. We go back even further, I believe, Ms. Brown, perhaps about, I think I met you about 29 and a half years ago.
I think so, yeah, that sounds about right.
Sounds about right. Yeah, just full disclosure, Nicole is my daughter, and I'm equally honored to have you joining in on this discussion as well. You bet. Dr. Jarvis, tell us a little bit about, you taught Russian, like I said, for 34 years at Brigham Young University. But I know you've spent some time in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, Ukraine. Tell us a little bit about that, as much as you'd like, and some of your other connections there.
Yes, I came to BYU in 1957, which seems like a very long time ago for most of your viewers. That was the year the Russians put up Sputnik, and it seemed like things were crazy then in the world as they are now. We had more ballistic missiles pointed at Russia than we had students studying Russian. I didn't think that was a good idea, so I started studying Russian. And things went downhill from there. I became a professor of Russian, often visited Russia, partly for professional reasons. And then I did spend some time in 1996 to 1999 as a LDS Church mission president there, and then went back in 2005 to 2007 to Belarus as a humanitarian missionary. So with my wife, who also is fluent in Russian. And so we got to know something about both countries, and we have many dear friends who are Russians. And I think one of the main things I'd like to see us is make a distinction between the Russian people and their government, because the Russians, even at that time of tensions, the Russians never blamed us for any of the tensions. They said, well, you know, don't blame us for our government. We're not going to blame you for your government. They probably should blame us for our government, but their government has never been democratic, very long anyway.
We've certainly had a lot more control over who our leaders are. Nicole, tell us a little bit about your connection with Ukraine.
So I arrived in Ukraine in 2009. I spent 2 years there, and I graduated high school. And it was just a wonderful time. I was in an international school that allowed me to not only spend time in Kyiv, which is the capital and where I lived, but we had many field trips to Odessa and Lviv and other kind of smaller towns in the country. But it was just a wonderful time. People were really kind, and they take a lot of pride in their country. And it was always really important to them to teach me to make because a lot of them would still speak Russian, but they would want to make sure that, we are Ukrainian, and they would make it a point to let me know their distinct traditions. So it was wonderful.
Nicole, you speak Russian then?
I speak a little, okay, a little, but I do speak more Russian than I do, I think, Ukrainian, just the nature of the capital. But yeah, I think shoot, is that little? Yeah.
Be careful. This is a professor of Russian.
Right.
You're fine. You're fine.
It's been over 20 years for me, but the phrase, and I'm going to butcher it, that I tried to memorize was "Yani poнимаю по-русски," something along those lines. Yeah, that worked for me a lot. And then they would start to speak English to me as much as possible.
Very useful.
Yes, very useful. You both have sort of mentioned something that I would kind of like to start with, and Dr. Jarvis, I'll start with you on this. What most of the students that are going to be watching this were born certainly after the Soviet Union was dissolved, and the vast majority of them were born in this century. They may not understand the relationship, the historical relationship that Ukraine and Russia have, Ukraine being independent. And then I'm going to go to and ask Nicole about this as well. But can you give us a little context about the relationship between those two countries?
Well, actually, the Russian state began as an area called Rus. There was mostly Scandinavian rulers, and I won't bore you with all the history, but there wasn't a distinction between Russia and Ukraine for most of its history, and the most distinction was in the 19th century when some of their nationalist intellectuals said we're different than Russia. That didn't mean that they don't have a different history. A good part of that, the period of the 17th, 18th, 19th century, Ukraine was actually part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So they did have a separate history, but you have to ask a local peasant, who are you? They'd say, well, I'm from this town. And they didn't have a necessarily distinct feeling they were Ukrainian, but it did become very strong in the 19th century. And since the fall of the Soviet Union, actually during the Soviet Union, Ukraine was a separate republic, which suffered terribly under Stalin. Something like 3 million people perished from famine in forced collectivization. And so there was a feeling that we're really suffering at the hands of the Russians. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine did become a separate country, and has been a separate country since 1991. And then its feeling as a separate country has grown tremendously.
Nicole, let's jump to 2009 and your connections with people to the present. Is that your impression from your friends, that Ukraine is distinct, that they're not a part of Russia, that they're not just separated by a border? We've heard reports that Russia is saying to some of the fleeing people, come on over to Russia, which to a lot of people seems absurd on its face, but is that your experience and knowledge?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I made the mistake when I first moved there, thinking, since, several of them would speak Russian, I was like, oh, I just thought they, maybe reflected their same like traditions or culture, but by the end of my 2 years there, I could clearly, see the line dividing them. And, once again, they were really, really proud of their country, and were always really excited to show me what made Ukrainians unique. And one of my favorite things they would have every year was this Ukrainian Independence Day, this festival, and it was just crowded with people in the capital, and they just really show a lot of pride for their country.
And Dr. Jarvis, you and I, of course, remember the Cold War. We remember when the Soviet Union disintegrated, and there were these two big alliances, the NATO alliance and the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact went away, but NATO stayed. And then what happened in the 90s to Russia?
Well, as the Soviet Union was falling apart, and as Gorbachev was negotiating with George H.W. Bush, Bush was really quite sympathetic and wanted them to feel as good as he could about the disintegration of that old Soviet empire. And he said, well, we promise, I think he said orally, that we promise that NATO won't move an inch into former Warsaw Pact countries. Now, he didn't necessarily have the right to say that, and it was never ratified by a treaty, but there are several oral reports of him having said that, and the Russians remember that and think that, okay, NATO wasn't supposed to move east. And so there's some resentment that what Bush told them hasn't necessarily, what they think Bush told them hasn't been adhered to. But that's.
We know that Putin and some of the people that are close to him see the expansion of NATO as a provocation. Is that the way the Russian people see it, by your estimation?
Well, I don't know. One thing we need to remember is that when your news media are managed, and Putin has dropped an iron curtain down on Russia. Actually, years ago, there were only 2 or 3 smallish stations where you could get some independent news, and we left Russia in 1999. And already then it was harder and harder to get objective news that had anything other than what the government wanted you to hear. And when people only hear one side of the news, it's almost impossible for them to form their own opinions. I do know that when Putin took Crimea, and there are a lot of Russians in Crimea, and that was very popular. And so that seemed like an easy thing to do, and was very popular with most Russians. And then I think when he took eastern Ukraine by stealth and by saying that it wasn't us, it was the nationalists there, I don't think that was quite as popular. But anyway, those are both 2 easy victories, and there were victories in the western part of Georgia and a place you've never heard of on the eastern side of Moldova, where there was a lot of support for joining with Russia. And so I think Putin was lulled into a false sense of this is going to be easy. But what the average Russian thinks, it's really kind of hard to say, and it's not their fault if they don't see the whole picture, because they haven't been given the whole picture.
Yeah, there's a reason why freedom of the press is enshrined in our First Amendment and why we call it the Fourth Estate. Without a free press, it's really almost impossible to determine whether or not people truly believe something or whether or not they're falling for propaganda. Let's talk a little bit about how Putin came to power, and perhaps, if we can, speculate a little bit about what his intentions are and state of mind and that sort of thing. I think a lot of people are wondering right now, and perhaps it's not a question we can answer, but the question still arises: is Putin a rational actor? Is he making decisions that are based upon some sort of sound reasoning? We know that he's talked about the Soviet Union's collapse as one of the greatest historical tragedies. And perhaps he's just trying to reestablish the former empire. But what's your assessment as of right now?
Well, I only know what you hear too, but many observers who've known Putin for some time say that he's much more emotional now than he used to be. There's a British reporting from an insider named Soloviev in Russia who claims that Putin had an operation for abdominal cancer in February, and there are numerous reports that he actually suffers from Parkinson's. There's not a lot of visible symptoms of that, but there's also reports that his partner, his live-in partner, basically a common law wife, really wants him to retire soon. And there are some rumors that he wants to retire at the end of the year. And so, maybe he's unhinged and emotional. Maybe he wants to leave some sort of a legacy. I mean, he feels that, he wants to protect Russia. At least that's what he claims. And one of those problems is, and you've seen the pictures of him sitting so far away from other people. I think COVID has been really hard on Putin, and he's isolated himself in a bubble. And when you only hear you live in an echo chamber where you only hear from yes men exactly what you want to hear, then that can destabilize you. So whether Putin is getting any outside information into his bubble is a question. And whether he's unhinged or not, I don't know. But his mental state should make everybody nervous.
Yes, and he certainly seems to be isolated. I mean, we've all seen these pictures of these hysterically long tables where he's sitting at one end and the advisors are sitting at the other. When I spent some time in Russia in the late 90s, to a person, I was told at parties and during conversations that Russia has a history of having very strong leaders, and that's what they needed, was a strong leader. Is that what they got, and they didn't know what they were getting? They didn't know how strong he would ultimately become, or what are your thoughts on that? And for you, Nicole, with respect to Ukraine, have they always seen Putin as an adversary? Let's start with Dr. Jarvis.
Well, during the 1990s, when Boris Yeltsin was in charge, he was very popular at first, and he's a libertarian. He really wants everything to be free. He wants all the rules to go away, and he just got rid of all the rules, got rid of the Communist Party, but not the people who used to be in the Communist Party. And a lot of the old Soviet leaders became the new Russians. And one of my former students is Astrid Tuminis, who's now president of UVU, and she went on to Harvard and then Harvard sent her to Russia to be a consultant there for the Russians. And when she came back, I asked her, well, Astrid, what do you think about Yeltsin? She said, well, he's a good bulldozer driver, but he's not a very good builder. And so he just destroyed everything, and he was a drunkard. And so they hungered again for some order. There weren't the guardrails that we have with our freedom. And so Yeltsin kept trying various premiers, prime ministers, and he noticed that Putin was less of a drunkard and more stable and crafty. And he said, well, this will be better. And so he put, just about the time we left Russia, Yeltsin put Putin in, and I don't think anybody knew what it would happen, because right at first he was good at stabilizing things. When we were there, almost all the grandmas were just really unhappy because their pensions were teeny, they were impoverished, they had a hard time, and the oligarchs were taking lots of money. The freedom and democracy for Russians looked terrible, and the Russians have a crude word for democracy. They call it turdocracy, and they weren't so interested in democracy. And even Russia has never had democracy for more than just brief periods in its entire history. And so the sense of order that Putin brought was welcome. And we noticed that, with our former president, that, in a time of difficulty, was lots of immigration and disruption, then there's hunger for a strong leader. And Russians themselves believe that they're not very good at establishing their own guardrails. They're not used to democracy, and so they want someone who can fix things. We saw the same thing in Germany in the Weimar Republic. Inflation was runaway, and they wanted someone who would bring order. And Mr. Schitzelgruber, or whatever his name was, known as Hitler, did bring order.
Yeah, and I'm going to circle back around to the Hitler analogy. I very often tire of everything being analogized to Hitler and the Nazis. But in this case, it might be
It's legitimate.
a little more legitimate and apropos. Nicole, what was your impression in 2009 through 2011 of the opinion of Russia, perhaps as an adversary of Putin himself? Of course, he's held power, but he's done a little bit of circling around in terms of the positions, but essentially been in power and was certainly in power at that time. What did you get any sense of? Did the Ukrainians see him as a threat? Did they see Russia as a threat?
Yes, they definitely did, and there was no there weren't any positive opinions about him. In my school, we did have Russians as well, and even among them, it wasn't. I mean, yeah, I mean, he was just not talked about, positively. It was, yeah, and especially as when I left in 2011, the whole Crimea incident was just a couple years after that, and it was definitely talked about in my school, kind of the last year I was there, and as Russia being this threat. Nothing. I definitely don't think they expected this, and I don't even think they expected Crimea at the time to just kind of like he was this shadow, lurking.
What years were you there, Nicole? What years?
I was there between 2009 and 2011.
Right. Well, 2013, 14 was Maidan and their revolt against Russian influence.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Let's circle back to this Hitler analogy. Like I said, if someone says that they're for building interstate highways, someone might say, well, Hitler helped build the Autobahn. Or if someone says, I'm a vegetarian, they say, well, Hitler was as well. And it can be used to sort of destroy any argument that they want. But here, like Hitler, Putin has talked about restoring an old empire. He's talked about reclaiming lands where ethnic Russians live, like Crimea and like in Eastern Ukraine. And of course, we can talk about what he's done in Georgia and elsewhere, the puppet regime in Belarus and that sort of thing. But does the analogy sort of end there? One of the things that I often bring up with my students is that Hitler sort of told us what he was going to do. Has Putin done something similar, Dr. Jarvis?
Oh yeah, yeah. He wants to restore the glories of Mother Russia, and there's a lot of nostalgia for the stability of this and the predictability of the Soviet Union. So he's made no secret of that.
Well, Hitler was able to get the Sudetenland, was able to get Austria, was able to run over Poland and run over France. How do you think it's going for Putin so far? And if poorly, do you think this surprises him?
Well, yeah, he claims to be a student of history, and he always preaches history to Western leaders, but he seems to be ignoring Stalin's history with Finland. In 1939, just after World War II began, in about November, Stalin invaded Finland after gobbling up the Baltic states, and the Finns say, we don't want to be gobbled up. We don't want to be part of your security pact. And they met the Russians with a ferocious resistance. And the Russians would come through the wooded roads with their tanks, and Finns in their white uniforms would ram logs into the sides of the tank treads and disable the front tank, and then go down the row taking care of the other tanks. And so eventually the Russians lost something like 150,000 men dead in 3 months, and their casualties, the total casualties, were 5 times what the Finns were. And Stalin was not a humanitarian, but after 2 or 3 months, he said, "Whoa, this is really not worth it. and uh, the Finns had to cede some territory, but he just decided it wasn't worth the cost. And one would hope that if Putin has any rationality left, he will say he was absolutely astonished by the ferocity of the resistance he's met in Ukraine, and I think that the disproportionate losses are similar to those in Finland. One would hope that he would. He's no humanitarian. Stalin wasn't a humanitarian. You'd hope he'd be at least able to calculate. I hope he's as good at arithmetic as Stalin was, and say this ain't worth it. But whether he will or not, I don't know. There are rumors that that he might not last forever. Maybe he wouldn't want to go down. He hates to admit defeat, but on the other hand, he wouldn't want to have this be a terrible calamity to leave for the next generation. So one would hope that there'd be some rationality, shred of rationality left in him.
And Nicole, I think you and I have talked about some images where the Finns were on their skis and had their rifles on their back, and yeah, they put up a very serious resistance to the Russians. Yeah, that's a great. And there's been some talk that of Finland joining NATO, but I think Dr. Jarvis, you said that's unlikely when we had spoken before.
Well, I don't know what present day Finns feel, but they have managed to live with a agreement of neutrality since 1945, and they've managed to do very well. I guess if anybody knows about Nokia phones, those came from Finland, and the Finns paid back their war debts, and they've managed to deal with neutrality. And so I would be a little surprised if they wanted to toy with with angering the bear by joining NATO. But there have been, I guess, some feelers put out on that.
We could talk about in a moment how the West has responded and the unity of the West, and perhaps a NATO expansion resulting out of this, or at least maybe Ukraine joining the EU or along those lines. But before we do that, Nicole, you've been in touch with people in Ukraine, that is up until you've lost the connection. Were you surprised by their level of resistance, and how would you assess the people that you know in terms of their resistance? What have you been hearing?
Yes, I was surprised. I knew this is something they obviously didn't want, but their passion behind this cause is what I think I was a little surprised about. I went to school with it was a private school in Ukraine, and very wealthy kids who I thought would maybe run from this fight, when the going got tough, and they have not at all. The women I have known, several of them have children, and they've all left their husbands behind to go fight. And my friends who I graduated with, who are male, they have been happy to stay behind. And it's been really interesting. I think a lot of this as well has been I think the shock that everyone has felt behind Zelensky as well, their president. I think he really has been such a wonderful leader to get this kind of response out of his people. They're really behind him. Those who have not been behind him before, when he was elected, I saw many of their opinions of him previously, but that's completely gone now. And as you had mentioned, it was nice to be in contact with them, but now things have obviously gotten much worse, and so they can no longer update me.
I'm sorry to hear that. And of course, those convoys of fleeing refugees, we've seen Russian bombing of some of those, maternity ward being bombed yesterday. Just some truly horrific scenes. But I think you're correct in that Volodymyr Zelensky has become a bit of a world hero, not just a hero to the people of Ukraine. Dr. Jarvis, are you surprised by the West's reaction and the level of unity? And I say the West, but of course it includes places like Japan, who have sat out a lot of these types of conflicts. They're joining in. Of course, we've seen Switzerland for the first time in over 100 years, well over 100 years, remove its neutrality. And we're seeing Germany sending nearly tripling its military budget, or adding in about 100 billion extra euros, sending in military aid, which at first they had a policy not to do. And of course, they have a connection with Russia for energy, and on and on and on. Are you surprised by the West and its unity? Often the free world, it's like herding cats to get them to do the same thing.
Absolutely. I've just been astonished and very, very pleased to see people pulling together and realizing this is, especially since there have been, some people say, well, the bad guys are winning and democracy is losing. And this has pulled all the democracies together and realized that we have to, as Yuval Noah Harari says, if we can stop fighting each other, nothing will stop us. And the idea that the culture, the most important thing is culture wars, the left versus the right, nationalism versus liberalism. That's seemed to have been backgrounded. And Harari says that Zelensky has shown us that the nationalism and liberalism, the democracy, go together, and we need to come together to find a way to do the right thing for all our people. That's the way, and it sort of pulled us all together. It's been quite remarkable. Another interesting thing, since I also serve as the Provo Mayor's sustainability advisor, one of my jobs is to look into the future and see about the future of energy. And I spend a good part of my time trying to get people to use more electric cars and stop using fossil fuels to heat their homes and buildings, and to build more energy efficient. So we're not so dependent on fossil fuels. And now we see Russia sort of holding Europe by the nose because it's so dependent on their fossil fuels. If we can get away from that and be more energy independent with renewable energy, we could reduce some of the problems we have in the world. And there seems to be some awareness that, wow, fossil fuels can be a serious problem, even though we may have to ramp up our production right now for a while. Everybody sees this has brought about a great deal of difficulty.
You said you're pleased with the reaction of the free world. Do you think the humanitarian aid, the military aid, which is primarily defensive, because NATO doesn't want to send offensive weapons in there and as a provocation to war with NATO, and ultimately could result in the unthinkable? Do you see it as sufficient? Would you increase it? And then I'd like to ask Nicole if she thinks that her Ukrainian friends, from what she knows, sees it as sufficient.
Well, I'm not a military specialist. I can't say whether it's going to be sufficient or not, but I've been impressed with how much damage the Ukrainians are managing to do to the Russians, who seem to be absolutely astonished. They have to wage a long-term war, and they weren't prepared for it.
What about the economic sanctions? Do you think that we've seen a drop in the ruble, and we've seen Russia removed from SWIFT? Do you think those economic sanctions are, for example, going to put enough pressure on the oligarchs that they can exert some sort of pressure on Putin, or is he too isolated? What are your thoughts on that?
I know that their reports are that the ruble has just dropped down to less than a cent on the dollar. And my guess is that well, I've heard that several oligarchs have expressed their discomfort to Putin, or at least publicly. Whether they get through to Putin or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
And here's another analogy to the fascists in Nazi Germany. Hitler was supported by oligarchs, basically, and these oligarchs didn't turn against him. And so whether Putin's oligarchs will turn against him, I don't know. But I think it's hurting them, and I think they're feeling bad about losing their yachts and their access to real estate. But whether that's enough, I don't know. But I know that they're what we're getting in the missiles. I saw a video of a Ukrainian missile bringing down a Russian helicopter, and we've seen photo after photo of Russian military equipment being destroyed by whatever things the Ukrainians have, plus bad maintenance of Russian tires. It seems to be a problem too.
And you brought up Harari, and I believe he also mentions that the Russians are going to suffer under this. The world is going to suffer, of course, in varying degrees. Of course, the Ukrainians are the ones that are suffering the most, and the images that are coming out of the Ukraine are truly horrific, and in many ways unthinkable for the 21st century. Nicole, are you aware of any opinions on kind of a personal level from the Ukrainians about whether or not they see the aid, the humanitarian aid, the military aid, and the economic sanctions as sufficient, or have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, no, they always express this when I've talked to them, especially the ones, I've been able to talk with several of them in DC. They've got a really large group out here, and they're very grateful for the help, but at the same time, they're really focused right now on this closing the sky, just not allowing these planes to come in, and they just seem to be struggling day by day, and I can see their point. I understand the consequences of that as well, but it's just, I think until we can close the sky like they have mentioned, I think this is going to continue just to wreak havoc on their country, especially, they've got a great resistance right now, but Russia still does have these vacuum bombs, and they're just really targeting all these civilian locations, and I think they're running out of food and water, and so I think just drastic decisions are probably going to have to be made.
Yeah, and I believe the ICC is looking at war crimes in Ukraine right now. Speaking of taking action, not just the West, but Nicole, you've recently taken some action, and I know we've had a discussion about it. This is a picture, of course, of you in front of the White House, I believe.
Yeah, the White House.
You live in Washington, D.C. Here at Dixie State, at times we've lit up the D that's on the mountain in blue and yellow, and we've kept our clock tower lit up in blue and yellow. And at our state capitol, there was protests that were quite moving, led by our governor and other leaders in both parties. Tell me a little bit about this picture. Tell me a little bit about what you think it accomplishes. I know I've had this discussion with my students quite a bit, who feel so far away from this. But what do you think this kind of collective action sort of leads to?
I believe when our voices are louder, and I think anywhere, this was great in DC. This was a wonderful day because it brought out, as I had mentioned earlier, just this enormous Ukrainian community. It felt like I was back in Kyiv again. Just I could hear it all around me, and I, hear the language. And but I think I I I feel like I've been continually shocked through this whole process, because the voice of support, as we have all talked about, throughout the world, is just amazing. I think the louder our voices are, um, I, I do believe it will make an impact, whether it's on, I don't know about Putin necessarily, but the more, countries that are united, and world leaders, I think it's really going to hurt him. And the other important, I think the other thing is to continue to be loud, and because I think this is going to be a really long process, and I just would really hate to see this start to get swept, under as time goes on. And so I think just continuing to show the support, continuing to find organizations to either donate supplies or donate money to, just to, continue. It was really great here at this event, with several senators who came to speak, and former ambassadors, and it was just, they really, help. They gave some pretty easy solutions to be able to help. So I think if you just look online and find ways you can help, that your voice is just definitely as loud in any location.
I think that's a great response. Do you have anything to add to that, Dr. Jarvis?
Well, I'm impressed that Nicole was able to participate in that, and that's a great picture. That's a real legacy picture. In response to the no-fly zone, Stephen Colbert flippantly said, "Well, with McDonald's closing down, all of Russia will become a no-fly zone." But I doubt that that's going to influence much. Who knows who will say uncle first, and just hope that the Finnish history will repeat itself here somehow. There is a report this morning on the Google News feed that Zelensky says that he thinks that Putin will be willing to negotiate soon. What evidence he has for that, I don't know, and I hope hope he's correct. He certainly
he is as well. Well, let's talk about that for a second. They'd spoken, the Russians had spoken about a ceasefire, and then we saw some bombing, including of that maternity ward. They said they weren't going to invade Ukraine, even as they were building up troops, and countless other things that Putin has said. I mean, can the Russians be trusted in any negotiation? Don't wait for the translation. Answer me now.
Zelensky says he didn't trust the Russians, but I don't suppose that we, in situations like this, you have to follow Reagan's advice to use that old Russian saying, "Trust but verify." So, what can I say?
Well, I hope that, we all, I think, hope for peace in whatever form it comes, provided that it's not a false peace that just simply turns Ukraine into a puppet regime of Russia. Do you think the people of Ukraine would allow that, Nicole, or is their resistance so firm? We watch these pictures of people putting together Molotov cocktails and staying in the cities to fight. Do you think even, and many analysts have said it's probably likely, that while Putin can capture the country, it's a much different prospect to hold it? And that's if the Ukrainians continue to, whether it's guerrilla warfare or any kind of resistance. Do you think they'll continue and maintain that resistance? Is that the sense that you get from the people there?
Absolutely. Especially after everything that has happened now, and kind of, as I had mentioned before, I think if Zelensky had given in early, maybe not so much, I mean, I think they would have, especially Western Ukraine. But yeah, now I think they're so angry. They're so hurt, you know, there's no way they'll, yeah, they'll stand for it.
Well, and of course, if they continue resistance, Russia might find itself in a quagmire, much like they did in Afghanistan. That brings me to the subject.
Vince,
Yeah.
speaking of quagmires, did you read the news today? They flooded huge areas northeast of Kiev. The Ukrainians did. Talk about a quagmire. Their heavy vehicles going to have a really hard time getting through there. That's a really old and dangerous trick, hydraulic warfare. But talk about a literal quagmire.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that yet. We talked about Putin as a potentially irrational actor. We've talked about the West supplying defensive military machinery and weapons. The reason, of course, is not just that Ukraine isn't a member of NATO and so isn't part of an alliance that would trigger Article 5 and mutual defense. It's also because of nuclear weapons, is it not, Dr. Jarvis?
Well, yeah, that's a really terrible spectacle. I think the correct adjective to use here is atavistic. Atavistic is when something from the past reappears unexpectedly and after a long period of absence. And when I was young, you know, we lived under the threat of nuclear weapons. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis as a student just back at BYU serving mission in Finland. I remember walking by one building and asking myself, will I live to have a family? We were facing World War III. They had, every town had civil defense shelters. There was a big business selling bomb shelters to people. It was very, and for years we were just thought we were on the edge of catastrophe. And the Kingston Trio had that silly song about they're rioting in Africa, bum, bum, ba, da, ba, dum, bum, they're starving in Spain. Anyway, it was this sense that the world is falling apart. The whole world is threatening. And I hate to see that again, but and part of the problem is that during the last president's era, there was a neglect of nuclear restraint treaties. And Harari points out that we have neglected those at our peril. Now we realize that one madman in charge of all those nuclear weapons threatens the entire world. So some people think that Putin is just using this for effect, putting his nuclear forces on high alert, but it's something you can't ignore.
Yeah, I think every child of the Cold War is familiar with the nightmare dreams that you have of everything disintegrating in a moment, and you know, duck and cover doesn't quite, you know, keep you safe from nuclear weapons, and it doesn't take that many to annihilate civilization, create nuclear winter, that sort of thing. Does this mean, because I was looking out at all my classes and these students, and I was saddened to that we'd had this period of time their whole life where we didn't truly feel that nuclear threat. Perhaps we should have done more with that period, but looking out over them, thinking they're going to have to go through that fear that I had hanging over me during the 70s and 80s as well. Sometimes it can be considered pie in the sky, but isn't it time we start talking about, if not even restraining nuclear weapons, beginning the process of eliminating nuclear weapons in this world? A lot of people say that's impossible. What are your thoughts?
Well, Harari points out, and many have pointed out, that with rational leaders in charge of nuclear weapons, it has initiated a very long period of peace among major powers. There hasn't been not a single incident of one recognized country invading another recognized country and wiping it off the map since 1945. That's over 70 years.
Mutually assured destruction.
Mutually assured destruction has resulted in peace.
But
And of
Putin
course, the
seems to
next
be
question
talking.
is, without nuclear weapons, would we have that? And I don't know the answer to that. But I certainly like the idea of reducing the number. We don't need 10 times the necessary number of nuclear weapons to destroy civilization, which we seem to have had in our arsenals.
That's correct. Nicole, tell me your personal feelings about this. Is this the first time that you've had this sort of fear of nuclear war, of civilization perhaps being on a precipice with the outlandish talk that the Russians and specifically Putin have put forth?
Yeah, this definitely in my lifetime. I feel like I've only heard stories, from grandparents and parents. And yeah, this is a new feeling that I've experienced, and hoped that also my kids would not have to be under threat from. Just hope they're obviously empty threats.
Yeah, I think the whole world is hoping that this is perhaps at worst a bluff. Nicole, let me stick with you for a second because we're getting close to running out of time here. And you can address this in any way you want, but would you mind telling us a little bit about, you'd mentioned before some of the people that you went to school. Can you kind of give us an update? It's interesting, human beings, we have trouble thinking of things on very, very large scales. But when it's the human connection is made through stories or through, personal relationships, somehow we tend to relate to it a little better. It might be part of our evolution. You can choose any story you'd like, or any discussion about the people but I just kind of wanted to turn this over to you and give you an opportunity to speak to that.
Yeah, no, I can give maybe one in particular about a family I knew there, and who I have the most updated and kind of current information on how they're doing right now. So there's this woman named Svetlana who has a daughter named Victoria, who's around my age, and she when we lived in Ukraine, she would come to our house daily and either help us with meal prep or going to the grocery store, helping us learn the language. And, she just became part of our family. It was just horrible when we had to say goodbye when we left in 2011. And so we tried to maintain, we've stayed in touch, over the years, primarily through email. But and so when this has all gone down, I knew that her daughter Victoria, Svetlana's daughter Victoria, she had. So I just had a son in 2020, and he's around 18 months, and so is her son, and she also. Victoria was married, and it's just really interesting to kind of, as you mentioned, you kind of just mirror your own life in a way, because I've been talking to Victoria a lot more than Svetlana, just because we were able to find each other through social media. And it's really hard to hear these stories about they were in Kyiv, and then they moved to Lviv to find a safer place to go, and just what she has to do to try to transport this little toddler, through these areas, or how to find, the specific food for him. And then of course it gets down to, you can't even find a specific food. Can I find food? Can I find water? And I just put myself in my own situation. That way she had to who were talking. She had to leave her husband behind, and he's tried to find ways to send her money, but now he can't even send money to her anymore because he doesn't even have a way to do that, and trying to find safety for them. He's it, it's just heartbreaking, so heartbreaking. And I can only imagine it myself. She said, sometimes right before they had to leave him for good, he'd check in for just a couple minutes and then go back out. And every minute is just so precious with someone you love, and they love you, and they're so concerned about this, their child. And it's just heartbreaking, and I'm just, and on a much smaller scale, I feel that to a degree, with every email or any kind of communication I hear from anyone. It's just this pure joy. And then when I don't hear from them, I'm like, okay, you watch the news like you think they're going to be on it. But it's just, yeah. So anyways.
You have male friends that are fighting as well.
Yes. And I heard from them pretty early on, mostly like general updates to everyone, on Facebook, and how they're going to fight, and how, and then now those are it's just gone, and a lot of the updates have been from the women, since all the men are required to fight there, and they're all happy to. I haven't heard any of them complaining about it, but just, yeah, these updates from the women are just really really sad. Those taking care of the elderly, or children, or some are fighting, some still stay behind to fight as well. But yeah.
Well, that leads us to the very end, and I don't think we could top that even if we wanted to. Dr. Jarvis, to you. That's pretty moving. Thank you for sharing that, Nicole.
Very moving. Thank you for that personal view. I have a dear friend who was a scholar here in Provo last year for 9 months during the academic year, doing research on religion and liberty with our BYU Institute for that subject. And he's from Kharkiv, which is a very Russian-speaking city, and he's a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, and his children speak Russian. Some of them don't speak Ukrainian, and he, of course, had to leave Kharkiv because it's being leveled. And he went down to a large city southeast of Kiev named Dnipro. But one of his worries is now that there's going to be this terrible hatred that Harari mentioned is being generated by this war, that he thinks it's going to be a shame that all things Russian may be rejected by Ukrainians, and it may be difficult for him and his family, to keep the good things from their Russian heritage, and there are many good things from Russian heritage. So that's one of the worst, in addition to truth, which is always a victim of war, the loss of human feeling, and the growth of hatred may be the worst thing that come out of this. And so, Putin wants to, he's concerned about Russian history, and we've had Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. I'm afraid he may be remembered as Vladimir the Short-Sighted.
Wow. Well, thank you both very much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking this time out of your busy schedules up there in Provo and over there in Washington, D.C. This was truly an honor, and I think that our university, the staff, the faculty, and the students are really going to get a lot out of this. I think the two of you were the perfect guests to have this conversation with. So thanks again. It was truly an honor.
Thank you.